Hello everybody and welcome from me and Dimitri to this week's Easy 11 Plus live lesson. It's wonderful to be back. I've just been very busy the last few weeks. So has Dimitri. He's been extremely busy sleeping and putting fur in my mouth. What are you doing, Dima? Anyway, lovely to see some messages in the chat. Tony Johnson. Hi Robert, OMG, it's been so long I missed. Also, I'm so scared my exam is in 1 month. You'll be fine. Yay, Dimitri, says Lena. Yep, and lots of people are saying hi. Fantastic to see you all. Welcome to Abu Hamid M. Ismail, whose first live lesson this is. Fantastic to see you here. And today we're looking at some descriptive writing, a really common kind of task. Dimitri doesn't want to concern himself with common tasks. A really common kind of task that turns up in many 11 plus exams. If you want to become familiar with many kinds of 11 plus exam question and use some truly fantastic resources to practice them, have a look at the RSL educational website. There's a link in the video description. Dimitri is so excited to go and use my resources that he's running off to do so right now. Okay, and welcome to Noella, whose first live lesson it also is. And here's the task that we're looking at today. And of course, if you're on my mailing list, you'll have received this worksheet already, and I'm sure you've already had a go at it. Dimitri is desperate to be let out of the door, so have a look at the picture and think about the question while I let Dimitri out. So Dimitri has gone off to use all my wonderful resources on the RSL educational website, and we're here to look at this. This image shows the surface of the planet Mars. And you look at the picture. What do you see? It looks quite ordinary. It looks like many deserts look. We've got this sort of ochre-coloured sand or dust. We've got rocks scattered around, and there are some vehicle tracks going into the distance. We might speculate that this is maybe a Mars rover turning its camera back over the route that it's just taken. We can also, what else do we see here? There's a point round about, there we are, about there, where it looks as though it had to adjust its course a bit and it skidded around a bit to deal with an obstacle. Or maybe, actually, if we look at the tracks, if we look up here, we can see that it looks like two sets of tracks. So maybe it took this route and then came back down along this route as well. There are various possibilities. What do we see in the distance? We see those mountains up there, which are looking a bit fogged. Is that the weather? Is that dust? Is it just an effect of the light or the atmosphere? We can see bands of different colours up there. More orangey there, sort of bluiness there. We can tell that this landscape is obviously rather hilly. And in fact, Mars contains some truly vast mountains, almost unbelievably huge mountains such as Olympus Mons. And we can see that the landscape is generally hilly, running up here, running up there, and so on. The sky, there's a kind of grey fuzz to it. And it's hard to tell whether it's still or not. Is it windy? Is there weather going on? Where we are here looks on the face of it quite calm, but if we look at those mountains in the distance, we might speculate that there's a lot of dust flying around, which is what's making them seem somewhat obscured, and that might be a useful thing to imagine as we write about this. The rocks are in various different colours. We've got various thoughts to go with there. We'll come back to that in a second. Describe this landscape in no more than one side of writing. I'm not necessarily going to write a full answer here. We're just going to write a bit to talk about the mindset that you take into a task like this and the sort of way that you approach it. You may not include any people or other characters. That isn't a normal exam instruction. The reason I've included it here is so that we can just focus on how you describe a landscape and how you can bring that to life without having any characters in it. But you are encouraged to imagine sounds, smells, and so on. So even though there's no character here to hear things or smell them, we can still talk about these things. When a question says something like you're encouraged to do something, or even you may wish to do something, treat it as an instruction. Do the thing. They're looking for you to do that. So here, if you just write about what you see, you won't be fulfilling the demands of the question. Now, looking at this picture, bearing those instructions in mind, we've spoken about how there might be dust in the air. What might you be smelling? Well, you probably wouldn't be smelling anything if you were really there, because you'd be in a spacesuit, because otherwise you'd be somewhat dead. So you'd just be smelling the inside of your spacesuit, which probably wouldn't be very nice. But let's imagine that you could smell what's out here. You probably aren't going to smell very much. There'll be whatever the dust smells like and tastes like. What about sounds? Well, the sound on Mars is actually very different. You don't need to know this to answer this question, but because the atmosphere is different, sounds are really muffled compared to what you'd hear on Earth. You might lose some of the higher frequencies. They actually take longer to arrive. The speed of sound is lower, so over long distance it takes longer for sound to reach you, but that may not matter here. But certainly the fact it's quite muffled. What might be here? I think we'll hear maybe the sound of the wind, if we imagine that that's some kind of dust storm in the distance. Maybe there'll be the noise of the odd falling rock stirred up by the weather, but not very much. I reckon this is quite a quiet landscape. We can't really deal with the feeling of touch, because for that you really do need a character. It's hard to say that something feels like something without imagining a character there, I think, in my opinion. We've got quite a lot to go on there. Let's get started. I haven't planned this at all, because I think it's often useful with these lessons for you to see my real thought process in action, rather than seeing me just writing out a pre-planned answer. Oh, there's one more thing that I wanted to talk about. You need to talk about this picture, but you can talk about things that are not shown in the picture as long as they fit in with the world of the picture, as long as they don't contradict it, as long as they don't go against it. But you should focus on details from the picture. Right, we're going to focus on a description of this scene that we can see, but let's show that we're fully engaged with the other instructions. So let's begin with something like the wind. So a common phrase would be the wind rises. I don't much like using common phrases. Let's start with that and think about how we can edit it. And we're going to call it sand. Let's call it dust. And we describe the colour as ochre, and ochre dust and ochre dust skitters across the surface in quick, darting flurries. Okay, so the wind rises is a reasonably common way of describing the wind, but I wouldn't say it's a terrible cliche. The rest of it is more specific. So the ochre dust is something that we see in the picture. We thought, what's the colour I went with? Ochre. You could say something like the rusty dust. I wouldn't say red. It isn't really red here. You could say orange, or you could not say anything. Do we need to describe the colour? If you haven't got something interesting to say, don't say it. That's a really good rule for writing. I think ochre is quite a nice word to evoke the colour here, so I'm going to keep it. But you'll notice that this is not full of adjectives. And the one thing you don't want to do is try to make your writing descriptive by just putting an adjective in front of every noun. The angry wind rises, and ochre and fine ochre dust skitters across the smooth surface. Do you see what I mean? Yeah, we've got quick flurries. And darting is I suppose it's sort of a deverbal adjective. And we got ochre, but we haven't got too many adjectives here. We're focusing on details that we imagine in the scene. They're things that are not told to us. We don't know that there's the wind. We don't know that the dust is doing this, but we can imagine it, and it does fit with the picture. So we got what we see here. What about bringing in a sound? Because, of course, the question encourages us to talk about sounds. What sound might we have? Well, we could describe the sound of the wind, but then we'd be circling back to the wind. Let's give the sound of something that the wind is doing. I mentioned earlier that we got all these loose rocks lying around. Why don't we go with the wind disturbing a rock? A fist-sized, let's be specific. Now, does it break loose? How does it come? It comes loose, it breaks loose. What if it breaks loose? That means it was attached to something. We could go with that, but I'm not seeing any big rock structures here that it might break loose from. And also that implies a lot of force. If there was wind powerful enough to break a rock away from something, I think we'd just see, we'd be looking into a dust cloud here. So a fist-side rock breaks loose. How about slips loose and tumbles? That's quite violent, but this doesn't look like a scene where violent things are happening. So, and slips down, we just said slips. And how could we describe the motion of a rock that kind of slowly tips down and tips down the slope? How about totters? It means to totter. It means to kind of wobble as you move. You can imagine this rock sort of wobbling down the slope. Wobbles would also work. Which one do we prefer? Totters or wobbles? We can't leave that in. You can't say totters / wobbles. You have to choose one. This is just me showing my thought process. And down to settle in in a wheel bed. Call it a wheel bed. The sort of furrows that have been carved out of the surface by the rover's vehicles. Our wheel bed, because you haven't specified it before. What do we like? Totters or wobbles? I'm going to go with totters. I think it's a tiny bit more interesting. Fist-sized rock slips loose and totters down to settle in a wheel bed. Now, one thing that you should always think about when you're producing any piece of writing is developing your ideas. Because what you don't want is something that could look like a bulleted list. The wind rises and does this. I don't know. The horizon. Do you see what I mean? We've got a list, and there's no connection, and there's actually nothing to make it a piece of continuous prose. We need to find connections, and the way to do that is that when you've expressed an idea, you should think about how you develop it. The second sentence here does sort of develop the first. The first one mentions the wind, and then by implication, it's that movement of the wind that might be making the rock come loose, but it isn't a very obvious development. What can we do with this? The rock slips loose and tottles down to settle in a wheel bed. What does it do there? Well, it sits there, but before that, I reckon that a fist-sized rock might wobble to and fro. Before we spoke about tottling down the slope, it tips to one side, then is still. It tips to one side, then is still. Then comes to rest. That's a nice phrase. It tips to one side, then comes to rest. So now we developed our idea a little bit. The wind rises and ochre dust skitters across the surface in quick darting flurries. If a size rocks down to settle in a wheel bed, it tips to one side, then comes to rest. Okay, so we got a nice little scene there with the rock as a character. Now that's a really important point that I want to make, because for any writing to be effective, pretty much, it needs to include characters. But you may not include any people or other characters. But how do you engage with a bit of writing if there's no character to it? So the way that you deal with this is that you give character to non-living things. So here we've just made the rock a little bit of a character. We've given it a cameo. We've focused on this rock. It is in motion. It has this experience, and then it lies still. And that gives a little bit of focus and direction. I don't mean that we're giving it emotions. I just mean that we're making it an active point of focus, a little bit like a character in a story. And looking for characters that you can make out of a landscape is a very useful trick for making it interesting. Which character am I going to move on to now? Well, as I look at this photo, my eye is drawn towards the distance. Up there, look how huge my hand is. Up there, where the mountains are kind of obscured by a kind of fog, but there's not much in the way of water on Mars. That is, it could be a heat haze, but let's go with the idea that it's the dust flurrying around. Mountains rise on the horizon. How about against the horizon? That's a nice way of putting it. Like the horizon is a kind of background, the mountains rise against it. Against the horizon. Faded. So what's happening here? The mountains are kind of halfway between the colour of the rest of the landscape and the colour of the sky, aren't they? The dust kind of blends them, makes them a mixture of the two. Mountains rise against the horizon, faded to a... They're kind of milky, don't they? Faded to milkiness. Remember, if you've got something like a word like milky, and you stick a ness on the end of it, the Y normally becomes an I. Faded to milkiness, by the dust. What's the dust doing? Well, the milk is a liquid. Let's stick with the liquid image. By the dust that washes across their face. So we're kind of characterizing there. Of course, a mountain has a face. It's the wall of a mountain, but it also makes them seem kind of human, something that washes across your face. I probably need to wash my face, to be honest, after a sweaty day in front of the computer. Faded to milkiness by the dust that washes across their face. You could say faces, but these mountains are one range, so this actually makes more sense. The dust that washes across their face and blends their peaks with the grey of the sky. Okay, let's overwork this a bit. Of the Martian sky, really emphasising the alienness of this environment. Okay, so we got a nice start here, I think. The wind rises and ochre dust skitters across the surface. A little bit of alliteration there, but not too strong. Skitters across the surface in quick darting flurries. A fist-sized rock slips loose and totters down to settle in a wheelbed. It tips to one side, then comes to rest. Mountains rise against the horizon, faded to milkiness by the dust that washes across their face and blends their peaks with the grey of the Martian sky. Now, this paragraph that I've just written is in some ways a static description of what's in the picture. I'm just describing what I can see, but I've given it a bit of motion, and that's a really important technique to think about when you're doing any descriptive writing. Don't just describe what is there, think about how it's changing or what action is going on. So yes, the dust makes the mountains look faded, but here I've got the dust washing across their face and blending their peaks, so there are active things going on. Where could we go next? What else could we do with this? Faded to milkiness by the... We haven't spoken about smells yet. So you can always use the senses as a way to give you more descriptive ideas. Faded to milkiness by the dust that washes across their face and blends their peaks with the grey of the Martian sky. We've been talking about the wind and the dust. Let's carry on with the dust here. The dust is our main focal point, I think, in this piece, and it seems appropriate bearing in mind what we're seeing in front of us. By the way, I'm not going to make this a very long lesson at all. It's going to be quite a short one. I'm just going to get started with this piece, and I'm going to leave you to go and get on with your lives. What time is it even? Let's have a look. 20 past. I'm going to make this really short, I think, but I'll take some questions after I've done this bit of writing and have a more balanced, sensible length of lesson. Okay, what am I doing? I'm trying to click on my streaming window when I should be clicking in my Word document. There is a smell. Now I'm just going to imagine. I've got no idea what Martian dust smells like. There is a smell of... I'm going to imagine it's a smell of staleness. Why not? I can go with pretty much anything I want. What I can't do is imagine a smell of rotting plant matter. I think that'd be unlikely. A smell of rich perfume, something like that would be unlikely. But a smell of staleness, I can imagine that, I think, based on this scene. There was a smell of staleness in the air. Yeah, maybe I'll say in the atmosphere, because that emphasizes that it isn't air in the way that we literally understand air with, its familiar mix of gases that we know on Earth. There was a smell of staleness in the atmosphere. And it's dusty, but I don't want to keep saying dusty. What does dust do? It kind of cakes against your tongue. A clinging cakiness. But I said milkiness. That's a clinging smell that... But I have to be careful here. I can't say that cakes on your tongue because there is no character here. The question is very explicit. No people or other characters, so I can't go talking about someone's tongue. That... A clinging... No, I'll just go with clinging smell. A smell of staleness in the atmosphere. A clinging stale. Dry and... What's the word to describe it being nasty? But not nasty, disgusting, just nasty as in not quite right. How about unwholesome? Something's wholesome, it's good, it's pleasant, it's positive. Unwholesome goes against those things. It's sort of unpleasant, but a little bit less directly. A clinging smell, dry and unwholesome. Let's go with feelings, but again, yeah, let's be adventurous. Let's try a feeling, but without explicitly introducing a character. So what might you feel? There's this dust flying around. I'm now going to say air because I don't want to say atmosphere again, and I'm a bit short of alternatives. The air, so if it's got all this dust, it's going to be kind of stinging. I'm not imagining somebody in a spacesuit here. I'm not imagining any specific character. The air bites with 1,000 needles that dig and scrape. Yeah, I quite like that. It's very melodramatic, it's very over the top, but a little bit melodramatic, a little bit over the top works because it brings life and action into this completely still scene. And if there's one thing, well, and I'll talk about big lessons in a bit. The air bites with 1,000 tiny needles that dig and scrape. Okay, now what can I do with this? I've covered many of the things I might want to talk about. I could talk about the colour of the rocks a bit more, but I've spoken a lot about dust and dryness and the overall appearance of the landscape. I've talked about the mountains in the distance. This is where another very useful technique comes in, which is that you can allow your scene to move through time. Not in a big way, but over the course of a short period of time. Yeah, so what can we do? We can have it get a bit darker, or we can keep with this idea of the wind, and we can have the wind maybe relent, pull away. The air bites with 1,000 tiny needles that dig and scrape. Then, with a last quick, did we say flurry already? Yeah, we did. With a last quick burst of anger, the wind relents and is suddenly still. What would happen? There's all this dust in the air and suddenly the wind is still, so now this gives us something new to describe. powder settles to the ground, sprinkling. Now, what's it going to sprinkle? Let's now talk about those kind of blue-coloured rocks. Oh, sorry, I haven't shown you the next bit. The wind, powder settles to the ground, sprinkling. Can we go with this? Blue rocks. Maybe we can do something more interesting with that. Sprinkling blue rocks with cinnamon icing, because the colour is also cinnamon, isn't it? As well as ochre. You could also see this colour that we're looking at here as being cinnamon coloured. With settles to the ground, sprinkling blue rocks with cinnamon icing. And okay, now what many people do here, many people who send their work to me, is talk about deafening silence. Never ever talk about deafening silence. It's one of the most boring and repeated things that people do. But you can engage with the same idea in different ways. Powder settles to the ground, sprinkling blue rocks with cinnamon icing, and the sudden, we just said suddenly, and the silence is so strong that it is almost a sound in its own right. So strong that it is almost, it is almost a sound in its own right. And now you can start to describe the scene, new things that you see, or in this new situation. So now, you can tell I'm wrapping up here. Now you might go back to talking about the mountains in the distance, the mountains that are up here. But how do they look now that the wind is settling? Can you see them better? Can you see details that are surprising that you weren't aware of before? And so on. So there are a few tricks here I want to emphasize. I'm going to wrap up here more or less. But I want to go through some important things. Find characters even in a landscape. Follow the journey of a rock, for example. Develop your ideas. Don't write anything that could be a bullet point list. Never ever write in such a way that each sentence introduces a new thing. Always look for options to develop your ideas. For example, the way that we developed the idea of the rock, the way that we developed the idea of the atmosphere, from the smell to the feeling. Then we had the feeling relent, and so on. So a couple of things there. Find new ideas by exploring the different senses and by adding change in time. So don't just say this landscape has this weather. The weather can change during your description. The time of day, for example, can change. So for example, the sun could rise or the sun could go down. There are various things that you can do to give direction to your writing. Move through the scene. Move between the foreground and the background. So that's something that we did here as well. There are all sorts of things that you can do. Let's read through this one more time and see if there are any last edits to make. The wind rises and ochre dust skitters across the surface in quick darting flurries. Darting flurry. So a flurry is like a whoof of wind, and a dart is a little quick movement. A fist-sized rock slips loose and totters down to settle in a wheel bed. So here we're using details from the image, but we're also introducing the rock as though it's a character and giving it movement. It tips to one side, then comes to rest. Mountains rise against the horizon, faded to milkiness by the dust that washes across their face and blends their peaks with the grey of the Martian sky. Okay, I explained why I had face, but I think it's a little bit confusing. I've got one face and several peaks. It looks inconsistent. By dust that washes across their faces and blends their peaks with the grey of the Martian sky. Martian. It's an adjective derived from a proper noun. It should be capitalised. Good thing I spotted that. There is a smell of staleness in the atmosphere. It could be a stale smell. Maybe that would be simpler, but smell of staleness sounds nice. I don't mind. A smell of staleness in the atmosphere, a clinging smell, dry and unwholesome. The air bites with the... We've gone from smell, and now we're moving to feeling. The air bites with 1,000 tiny needles that dig and scrape. Crucially, I'm not saying that dig and scrape my skin or anything like that. So I'm staying away from introducing a character because the instructions tell me not to. Ordinarily, you could say something like on my skin. As long as you don't make your character do lots and don't get lost in your thoughts, it would be okay. It's just for this task that you can't. The dig and scrape. Then with a last quick burst of anger, the wind relents and is suddenly still. Powder settles to the ground, sprinkling blue rocks with cinnamon icing, and the silence is so strong that it is almost a sound in its own right. Let's make that a little bit simpler. It is almost a sound in itself. That's a more concise way of saying the same thing, and I think concision is good. Okay, I think that'll do. Let's call it a day there. There's more that you could write. However, if your task is to write no more than one side, bear in mind I've typed this. This is probably 2/3 of a side of handwriting. So you're well on the way. There's probably just a bit more to say, but I'm not going to say it now because I don't want to bore you to death. All right. Okay. Tip of the week. Let's stick to practicing writing. You'll be looking at lots of exam tasks and so on. Things like this thing that we were just looking at. What am I doing over there? It was over there, wasn't it? Things like this that we've just been looking at. And of course, you'll look at exam creative writing task after exam creative writing task. My tip of the week is also to make time to write about things that you enjoy writing about. Writing about police car chases or alien invasions is not encouraged in the 11+ exam because they're hard to write about well, and people tend to basically write movie scenes, which tend not to work. But there is absolutely no reason that you should not enjoy also writing about them in your own time. Write about things you enjoy as well as about the things that you need to write about in an exam. It'll make you a better writer overall. It'll also help to remind you of why it's worth writing, that writing can actually be fun, that it can be about creating things that you want to create and not just about making an examiner happy. Yes, you need to learn certain things for the 11+, but writing should also be a pleasure, a way of expressing your ideas, a way of discovering how you think, of exploring your relationship to the language or the languages that you speak. And so don't just write for the 11+ exam. I can't really think of much worse than that. All right, okay. Do you have any questions? Thank you very much to Tatty Start Saver. It could be that can be broken up into your name, or it could be that it's just a nickname. I've no idea. Anyway, the question from Tatty Start Saver is, what are some hard words for the 11+? Well, of course, there are, hundreds, thousands at least of hard words in current use in English that you could potentially use in the 11+ exam. Don't use them. Don't go rummaging through a thesaurus, finding all the hardest words and finding ways to crowbar them into your 11+ writing. The best writing is writing that uses the words that you already know in the best possible way. Your vocabulary that you have will include some more difficult words, but you shouldn't use a word because it's difficult. You should use a word because it's the best word to do a job. So if we look back at the bit of writing that we were just doing, there are words here that are relatively hard words. Ochre, for example, is not that common a colour word. Totter is not a very common verb. But these were the best words that I could think of to do the job that I wanted to do at the time. And by thinking, what's the best word that I know to do this, I came up with some words that are slightly less common. You might say hard, based on your question. So don't think, what's a hard word that I can use? Think, what is a good word that I can use? What's the best word for this job? And as you develop your vocabulary, sometimes that will be a harder word. But that's the way that you should think about it. People who have a list of favourite difficult words and who try to, as I say, crowbar them into their answers, tend to end up writing badly. I don't recommend doing that. You should be learning to write well. How do you guys copy each other's names? It's just because everybody I've ever known called Robert Lomax has been, really, really cool, really admirable, somebody I wanted to be like. So I've just copied that name and used it as my own. If you knew what name I was born with, you'd realise it was actually very, very boring. Hang on, that wasn't a question for me, was it? So you're not angry anymore. I'm not angry with anybody else. Obviously, I'm quite angry with you, but no, okay, that's not a question for me either. Robert, should I read 18 plus books to increase my vocab? I'm assuming you mean books written for adults. It's certainly good to read more advanced books, but read books that you enjoy. If you read books that you don't enjoy, you won't remember anything from them, by and large. A bit of advice that I often give is to look for books that are slightly more advanced than some you've already read, but on topics that you already enjoy. So, for example, if you enjoy, we're on a Martian theme here, if you enjoy science fiction stories about travelling to other planets, then look for some books for slightly more mature readers that still deal with those topics, because then you'll be interested in them, and then you'll actually be like to remember things that you read. And that's a really good way to approach it. What you shouldn't do is just lose yourself in a pile of impossibly difficult books where you don't know every third word, and it's just torture and you don't enjoy it, you don't get into the books, because then you'll just stop enjoying reading and you won't learn anything from them anyway. If you're currently reading books for children, then look at books for what's known as young adults, in other words, more or less, mid-aged teenagers. If you're already reading books like that and find them quite easy, then look at some not horrendously difficult books for adults, possibly. But I think for most people watching this, the books that you'll be interested in will be tipping into maybe the young adult range, as opposed to books for children. Someone says, Rob, I got 402 on my mock test. Is that good? It depends what the test is and so on, and what the score's out of. I've got absolutely no idea. I'm sorry, I can't help you with that. But you will have a sense of whether you did well on the test, whether you produced answers that you feel happy with, and that's going to be a better guide than anything that I might say. Rosina says, I love you, Robert. I love all of you, all of my viewers, those who do comment and those who don't. Do you have any tips for someone who is homeschooled? That's a huge question. But take responsibility for your own learning. Think about your own learning strategies. You need to be, everyone who needs to do this, but you in particular, not having support of school teachers and classes and classmates, you need to work out how you learn best and find ways to make your learning most effective. Don't just rely on doing what other people tell you to do, including me. Do you need to read a dictionary for 11 plus? No, reading a dictionary would be extremely boring. However, when there's a word that you don't know, it can be worth looking it up in a dictionary. My advice that I often give is, and this may sound counterintuitive, when you encounter a word that you don't know for the first time, don't look it up. Why? If you've seen this word for the first time, then it's quite likely that you won't see it again for another 3 years or something. It's probably an unusual word. And if you look it up and learn it, it probably isn't going to be a very useful word. It won't be the best use of your energy. My advice is that when you see a word that you don't know for the second time, then you look it up. In other words, you're reading something and your thought process is, I've seen that word before, but I don't know what it means. That's when you look it up, and that's when you write the meaning down, and that's when you write practice sentences. Because the fact you've seen it for the second time and don't know it means that this is not an incredibly rare word. This is a word that gets used in more than one situation, a word that it might actually be well worth you knowing, and that it might be worth your using. And so that's how I build a vocabulary list. I'd use your dictionary, whether it's a physical one or an online one, to look up words that you have seen before and still don't know. And that'll be a useful list of new vocabulary for you to learn. One more tip there, when you're using dictionaries, whether they're in a book or online, always look at words in context. What does that mean? It means that you should find example sentences of how the word is actually used, because a word can theoretically have the same meaning as another word, but actually be used in very different ways in practice. So websites such as dictionary.com will give you example sentences The Cambridge Dictionary online, that's a good one because it's British English rather than American English. So the Cambridge Dictionary online will give you example sentences where a word is used. And those example sentences will help you to understand a word and work out how you can actually use it yourself correctly to create the effects that you want to create. So don't just look up a word in isolation, look up how it's used. Someone wants a video on algebra. I will certainly do more videos on algebra, but there are loads of videos of algebra already on my channel. Linked in the video description is something called Video List, Creatively, which is a list of all the video lessons I've ever done. You can trawl through that, or you can search the document and find videos on equations, on algebra, those kinds of words. I'm going to wrap up in a second. I think this has gone on long enough. Someone says, how do I increase my vocab easily? This is a good question to answer because the answer is simple. You can't. You can't increase your vocab easily. For any learning task that matters, if you could do it easily, then you probably already know it. These things take hard work. Virtually anything that's worth knowing takes work to know. And increasing your vocabulary means doing the kinds of things that I've just spoken about. You know, noticing words that you've seen before and don't know, researching them, writing them down, writing practice sentences with them, practicing using them in your day-to-day life. That's how you build a vocabulary. Yes, there are some people who just read loads of books and develop a big vocabulary over time, but that isn't easy. That involves reading thousands and thousands of books, and I really do mean thousands and thousands. There isn't an easy way to do this. There isn't an easy way to do any of this. All of this takes work, and to some extent, that's what makes it worth doing as well. So the answer is no, you can't. Okay, I am going to call it a day. Right here, because I think we've been going on for long enough. So it's been fantastic to have you. I will have a celebratory sip of my coffee as I go, and I look forward to seeing you for the next Easy 11 Plus live lesson. It might not be next Tuesday because I have a feeling I might be doing something else next Tuesday night. Sorry, but it will be soon. I will let you know. If you want to get into my mailing list to find out all about when I am and I'm not doing lessons, then the easiest way to do that is to go to the RSL Educational website and go to the free resources page and sign up for them, and that will also stick you onto my mailing list, and then you'll get email announcements about all of my lessons. All right, enough of that. Fantastic to see you. I'll see you for the next lesson. It might be next week, it might not be, but you'll find out. See you then.